Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to the beginning of Series 7 of the English Speaking Union Happy Hour. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Barbara Perry, who will be speaking about the Kennedys in England. My name is Barbara Hughes. I'm a member of the Happy Hour Committee, as well as being a national board member. I would like to thank the Central Florida branch, which is sponsoring today's Happy Hour. Ideas for our happy hours come from our ESU members as well as viewers. At the end of this program, you will receive a survey in your email where you are encouraged to give feedback on today's lecture, as well as you are welcome to share some ideas for future happy hour lectures. Some other notes about today's presentation. There will be a question and answer at the end, and you may submit your questions at any time during the program using the dedicated Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. However, do note that the questions will be answered in the order that they are received. I am so pleased to announce that today we have 247 people who have registered. And the branches that have the most people registered are Central Florida Branch, Greenwich, and New Orleans. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Barbara Perry. She's a native of Louisville, Kentucky, and she earned her PhD in government from the University of Virginia, an MA degree in politics, philosophy, and economics from Oxford University, and a BA degree in political science with highest honors from the University of Louisville. Barbara is the Gerald L. Baliles Professor and Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. She also directs the President Oral History Program. She has authored or edited some 17 books on presidents, first ladies, the Kennedy family, the Supreme Court, and civil rights and liberties. She has served as the 1994-95 Fellow at the United States Supreme Court, where she won the Tom C. Clark Award. She is also a frequent media commentator and columnist for national and international news outlets. She has appeared on interviews with CBS, PBS, CNN, and many other stations. She serves on the board of directors at the White House Historical Association, as well as the advisory board of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation and the board of Friends of the John F. Kennedy National Historical Site. She has received numerous awards. Some of the few I'm going to share with you. In 2012, she received the Virginia Social Science Association's Scholar Award in Political Science. The Sons of the American Revolution, Virginia Society, awarded her their 2013 Silver Good Citizenship Model for her outstanding achievements in the study of writing and teaching of American history. The University of Louisville College of Arts and Science named her the 2014 Alumni Fellow of the Year. There are many more that I could go on and share with you, but now I'm going to actually introduce her and present her, and I do have the honor to do that, Dr. Barbara Perry, to all of you. Barbara?
Well, thank you, Barbara, my dear namesake, and one of my newest friends in Winter Park, Florida, at the Central Florida branch of ESU. I got to know Barbara and Elaine and many others in that branch this past March when they had asked me to come down and speak on this topic. And Winter Park is so close to my heart because it was the place I moved to right after graduate school to take up my first teaching position at the University of Central Florida. So I left a little piece of me there, and I always look forward to going back. And as we will see today, Also have a soft spot in my heart for the ESU. I do want to thank Barbara Hughes and Jeff Schnabel of the committee on Happy Hour. I also want to say happy hour. I have my Rose Kennedy libation here, and I'm using one of my rather large sherry glasses from when I was at Oxford. So cheers to everyone. So that I would not become too happy and stray beyond the script today. It is the virgin version of this drink, but that is especially appropriate since I'm coming to you from Virginia, the former colony that was named for the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I, but also that Rose Kennedy was a great devotee of the Virgin Mary. She very much had in her heart a closeness with the Blessed Virgin Mary. And sadly, she said that when she was attending the funerals of Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, her sons, she gained strength by thinking of the Blessed Mother standing at the foot of the crucifix when her son was crucified. So there is a linkage there as well. Also want to thank Grace Darling today for tech support, and certainly Stefan Lebrun, because he is helping us with our slideshow, which will be very much a part of the conversation today. So if I can have Stefan move to that, we will get started with the Kennedys in England, and the subtitle, as you see here, is From Fairy Tale to World War II Nightmare. This picture that I'm featuring here on the opening slide is of all the Kennedys gathered together, all of the 9 children of Joe and Rose. How many can you name as you go along the line? Starting with the eldest, Joe Jr., on the far left, standing behind his mother, Rose, who's at the seat of the piano. And then I'll let you go across the picture there. We'll come to the next slide, Stefan, if we could, and take a look at why the ESU is so meaningful to me. And as I say, I have such a soft spot in my heart for it. And that is because in the 1970s, my home state of Kentucky had one of the largest branches that was run at the time by a man called Josh Everett. And every summer, that branch sent 15 to 20 college students from the Commonwealth of Kentucky to a summer program, usually at Oxford, for 6 weeks. Also to stay with our host families in England. I stayed with the John and Audrey Broadway family in Winchester. John Broadway had just finished a term as the mayor of Winchester in that historic town. I also stayed at the home of Sir Stuart Mallinson, just outside of London. And so for this young woman who had just graduated, in my case, from college, in a working class family that didn't have many opportunities to go abroad, except for my father's service in Italy during World War II, and didn't have opportunities because of the Great Depression for higher education. To be able to go and spend a summer at Oxford was really something. But the reason the Kentucky branch was so strong at that time was because Ambassador Robert Worth Bingham Jr., who was the owner and publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times newspapers in Louisville, had been the ambassador to the court of St. James just before Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. would take that position in 1938. And Worth Bingham Jr., the former ambassador's son, Barry Bingham Sr., by the time I was in college at the University of Louisville in the 1970s, Barry Bingham Sr. was the worldwide head of the English-speaking union, following his father's footsteps with a great love of the British-speaking countries, particularly the UK. And so Barry Bingham and his wife, Mary, subsidized the University of Louisville students, particularly who were selected for these ESU scholarships. So I think for a total of $500, I had, covering all expenses, including my airfare, 6 weeks in Oxford and a week traveling around England and into Scotland as well. I loved and fell in love so much with Oxford that I was able to go back on, thank goodness, to another person from Louisville called Mary Churchill Humphrey, I think related to the Churchills of England and then the US, of course, had given this money to endow a scholarship for 2 years to Oxford for a University of Louisville graduate. So it was, I called it the Louisville Roads. So I got to go back for 2 years, as Barbara mentioned to you, did a degree in PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics, a second bachelor's degree for me that matured to a master's degree, and then launched me into my PhD here at the University of Virginia some years later. But you will see me then standing under the Hartford Bridge. For those of you who know Oxford, this is based on the Bridge of Sighs in Venice. It connects two wings, two sets of buildings for Hartford College right across the street from the Bodleian Library. I'm dressed in what is called subfusc, or academic regalia. Just finished my 8 days, it's actually 7 days of 8 exams. So I took 8 exams on all of the courses I had taken in 7 days, and I was quite thrilled to be finished. And my father loved particularly this picture because in the background were my 2 best friends at Oxford, Jeremy and Fiona. And Jeremy was sort of an Evelyn Waugh character, idiosyncratic, sitting on the roadway under the bridge. And my friend Fiona from Northern Ireland, and we've remained friends to this day, chatting away with him while I celebrated. So we'll have the next slide to let you know, as I say, first of all, why I'm so enamored of the ESU, but also as it did for me, it changed my life utterly to go and have first 6 weeks thanks to the ESU, and then go back for 2 years at Oxford, which is really a crossroads of the world. Scholars, faculty, students from all over the world coming there, and it really just broadened my horizons, and I think helped me to know that I wanted to be a scholar and that I wanted to be a professor and to teach American politics. For the Kennedys, it was very much the same, in that a year or so that many of them were able to spend there with Joe Kennedy Sr. when he took up the ambassadorship, it became a life-changing experience, a life-molding experience for them. And as you will see, somewhat indirectly and sometimes directly, it really changed the political trajectory of the family. So next, please. Many of you may know that Joe Kennedy Sr. Was a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt. Joe here on the left, and Franklin sitting at his desk in the White House on the right with Kentucky, I should say a Kentuckian Justice Stanley Reed, who had just sworn in Joe Kennedy to be the ambassador to the Court of St. James and to succeed Robert Worth Bingham of Louisville, who had fallen ill and had to come back to the States and died shortly thereafter. So Joe Kennedy followed in the footsteps of his father and his father-in-law in the Democratic Party. He had decided that he would support Franklin Roosevelt's first run in 1932. By this time, Joe was a multimillionaire based on the money that he had earned in the stock market and had withdrawn cleverly before the great crash of '29. And then he had also made millions in Hollywood film production, which would help the family, as you will see as we go along, particularly in London, because he knew how to produce the family. He knew how to show them in media, and particularly in videos and newsreels of the time. So he worked with Roosevelt, campaigned with him, was on a campaign train with him, particularly out in California, because Joe knew so many movie stars and producers and people like William Randolph Hearst in California. He would get money from them. He would give money to the campaign himself. He hoped that in return, that when Roosevelt was elected in '32, that Joe hoped that he might get a cabinet position. And he was particularly hoping for, as Rose was, his wife, Secretary of Treasury. They thought, given his millions and the fact that he obviously knew business very well, that would be the perfect spot for him. He didn't get that position. It went to someone else, and he waited and waited, bided his time. And the first opportunity that came from Roosevelt was for Joe Kennedy to be head of the Maritime Commission. And this was important, as it looked like there were war clouds gathering in Europe, perhaps, certainly the Far East. Joe had run a shipbuilding company near Boston during World War I. In fact, that's when he first got to know Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. So they'd gotten to know each other then. And so Joe actually did quite a good job as head of the Maritime Commission, knew that the United States, in terms of its armed ships, was not anywhere near where it needed to be, and so was pushing for that. But he also got another offer from Roosevelt to become the head of the new Securities and Exchange Commission. This was founded by Roosevelt and the Congress As you can imagine, after the Great Crash of 29 and the horrors of the Great Depression that were still underway when Roosevelt came into power in 33, 25% of Americans out of work, homes being lost, farms being lost, businesses going under. So it seemed odd to some people that Joe Kennedy, who had been so clever, maybe because of inside information to get out of the stock market before it collapsed in 29, that he should be put in charge of Wall Street. Some said it was like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. But clever always and shrewd was Franklin Roosevelt. I think he felt quite correctly that what better person to police Wall Street than someone who knew Wall Street inside and out and knew how to do insider trading and to try to stop it with the new rules and regulations and laws that had come into being after the crash of 29. So Joe is really thrilled then when in 1937-38, he gets the word from Franklin Roosevelt that he wants to appoint him to be the next ambassador to the Court of St. James for the United States, and that Joe Kennedy therefore would be the first Irish Catholic to hold that position. May we have the next? Well, it was the case that all 9 of Joe and Rose's kids don't come at one time, and they always had, the Kennedys, I think, a great Irish wit and sort of sparkle about them. And Joe Kennedy said, I didn't want to create a housing shortage in London by bringing all 9 of my children. And some people years later would look back and say, there had never been an Irish Catholic ambassador from the US to the Court of St. James. There certainly had never been a US ambassador to the UK who had 9 children, ranging in age from young Teddy Kennedy, here you see on the top left and in front of his dad. He's just 6 years old at the time, still in short pants, all the way up to big brother Joe Jr., who's in the picture on the far right at the bottom here. So the first Joe goes by himself. Rose, about the time she thought she would go with him in March or so of 1938, came down with a sudden emergency appendectomy. So she was put under for just a bit, but she decided to go then in March, in later March of that year, and bring with her the following. So you see Teddy in the front. They're all marching. They've just arrived in London. Joe has greeted them. Kathleen is on the left. She is known as Kick. As her nickname. And then you see Rose just next to her husband. To Rose's left, to our right, as we see it on the screen, is Patricia Kennedy. Then the youngest daughter is Jean. She's the second youngest of the 9. Teddy is the youngest. And then Robert Kennedy is on the far right. He's a young teenager in his suit. He had been interviewed on the ship as they left New York to come to England. The newsreels were all there. By this time, the Kennedys were already well known in American politics, certainly in part because of Rose Kennedy's father, who had been a member of Congress in the 1890s, and then in the early part of the 20th century had been mayor of Boston. But they were now national and international figures. And Bobby Kennedy was being interviewed by the press, and he said, I'm so excited. This is my first trip abroad. I couldn't even sleep last night. You know, they had that great Boston accent. I couldn't even sleep last night. So then you have on the top right, the next 2 who come. And these are the older daughters, Rosemary, who's the eldest of the daughters. She's 3rd in line after Joe and Jack. And as we all know, I think about her, had intellectual challenges. In the vernacular of the time, she was called mentally retarded. She had a low IQ and was diagnosed with this disability when she was in 1st and 2nd grade. She was told, and her parents were told, well, the only thing we can suggest, these were the experts in the Boston area, even at Harvard, was probably just put her in an institution. The Kennedys were very much ahead of their time and thinking that they didn't want to put her in an institution. They knew that the horrors of those kinds of institutions in those days. And so they were very much ahead of their time in mainstreaming her. That is that they would bring in tutors for her. They could bring in coaches, but the child, the sibling who was closest to her was just under her in age. Kathleen had come just after, and then Eunice. So you see Eunice here on the top right, far right. She and Rosemary arriving at the same time. in London. Eunice always looking out for Sister Rosemary, and you probably know that Eunice would go on in adulthood to found the Special Olympics. And so Rosemary comes with the family and is mainstreamed in effect with them in the embassy. She does go to some convent schools, so sometimes she's away as the other girls are attending convent schools, and so they're not always living in the embassy, but she does very well there. Then the two boys, the eldest boys and the apples of their eye, particularly Joe Jr., who was the firstborn, they had been at Harvard as students. And so they waited until their semester of that spring of 38 ended and then came over just in time to be greeted by their father and to attend the July 4th celebration that historically the U.S. ambassador holds at the residence. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we come towards the end today. But let's move on then to talk about the fairy tale and what that looks like and what it means for the family. So if we can go to the next slide, you're going to see, first of all, at the top left, yes, that is the King of England and the Queen. That is King George VI. And his wife, who was also called Queen Elizabeth. Those of us who knew her after her husband had died, would think of her as the Queen Mother to distinguish her from Queen Elizabeth II, her daughter, who came to the throne after her father died in the early 1950s. Joe and Rose invited the King and Queen to a dinner at the U.S. Embassy, and Rose was in her element. If Rose couldn't be an ambassador, and of course it was hard for women to break into politics and ambassadorships in the 1930s, the next best thing for her was to be the wife of the ambassador, of this plum job in the foreign service, if you will. And that's because she had really been almost like a surrogate political wife to her father, Honey Fitzgerald, John F. Fitzgerald, the namesake of John F. Kennedy, because her mother had a total of 6 children. Rose was the eldest, and her mother was in childcare. She was much of an introvert. And so Rose really became like a political spouse to her father, even when she was a teenager. So she just loved this kind of opportunity to, you can almost literally see her rubbing elbows with King George VI. And one thing that I always like to point out is that, you know, the king that it will be 2 from now. So we have King Charles, then we'll have King William, and should the line of succession continue past that, we'll have King George VII, little Prince George now, who's just turned 10. He turned 10 on the birthday of Rose Kennedy. And I think she would be thrilled to know that she shares the birthday with a future King of England. So this was in part what the Kennedys were doing, the adults. The children, here you see on the top right, young Teddy and young Bobby were invited to come open a new children's exhibit at the London Zoo. And there's a baby elephant going right for Teddy's hand because he's got a peanut in his hand. So he's recoiling a bit from it, but you can tell that they're having a good time. Down on the bottom left is part of the family in the embassy in London. And they are having tea in one of the paneled rooms there. And again, you see Teddy front and center. Rose would say later on that the media fell in love with the family in London because there were so many of them, and they were bright and vivacious and athletic and charming and witty and handsome and beautiful. And she said, particularly Teddy, you know, all the media fell in love with the little 6-year-old Teddy, and he was a bit of a ham, so he could always think of something cute to say to those who were snapping pictures. On the far right picture at the bottom, you will see on the far right in that picture, Rosemary, her mother in the middle, and then Kathleen on the left. This is as they are about ready to leave for Buckingham Palace to be presented to the King and Queen. So this is what I mean by mainstreaming Rosemary. Her mother, Rose, worried a little bit, you know, would she be able to comprehend all of the protocol, how to curtsy, step up to the King and Queen, curtsy to them, then step back. And she might have had a little trip there, but she did very well. And you can just see also how beautiful she was and how vivacious she was. And she just blossomed in London, as really the whole family did. But her parents were so pleased that this, again, they wouldn't have called it mainstreaming in those days, but that their strategy was working, and they did find a convent for all of the girls to study in. And it worked out really well for all of them, but particularly for Rosemary. So if we can go on to our next slide, which is a postcard. Now, Joe Kennedy said that when they visited in the Buckingham Palace, visited there, but also when they went to Windsor Castle for a weekend, he and Rose, to visit with the king and queen and the princesses, he said, turned to Rose while they were dressing for dinner and said, "This is a hell of a long way from East Boston." Well, that was where he was born and raised, in East Boston, in an Irish immigrant enclave. Rose had been born in the North End, which became the Italian end of Boston. But they were just both so thrilled that, boy, had they made it, from coming just 2 generations removed from the Irish potato famine, when both sides, Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys, had come to Boston in abject poverty, and from the peat bogs of Ireland to Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. Now, this is a postcard from my personal collection, my personal archive. I was able to find it and purchase it. It is something that Rose Kennedy loved to do. When she was at a famous home, whether that was Windsor Castle in this case, and by the way, the postcard is embossed with Windsor Castle in red and then this coat of arms. So it's sort of a raised, embossed red printing. She loved to write to her friends and family to say, "Here I am in Windsor Castle," or "Here I am at the White House overnight." She'd send these to her children, and then she'd always put a postscript, "Please save this." In other words, for her as well as for their own scrapbooks. Well, a woman called Marie was her friend, and she sat down, I guess, at Windsor Castle to write this postcard back to her in the States to say, "Joe and I are leaving in the morning," that is from Windsor Castle, "after a very brilliant weekend. We had Sunday dinner today with the 2 little princesses." Who are they? Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose, who were about the same age as Bobby and Teddy. And so Bobby and Teddy actually got to know the 2 little princesses, one of whom would become Queen Elizabeth II. And so Rose says they had Sunday lunch with the little princesses as well as the king and the queen. And then she ends, "They all are charming. Love to you, Rose, April the 10th, 1938. So Rose and Joe were absolutely in their element. All right, if we can carry on to the next, please. The fairy tale ends up being, I think, an irony, as well as what would become a tragedy. So you have this quintessential Irish American family that, again, is only a few generations removed from the Irish potato famine and the peat bogs of utter poverty. That's why the Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys left Ireland to come to America for opportunities. But anyone who knows history knows of the conflict between the British and the Irish. So here these quintessential Irish Americans embrace the British and become Anglophiles. Now, I don't mean to indicate that they turned their backs on their Irish American heritage. They remained proud of that, to be sure, but they really did become Anglophiles. Joe and Rose certainly did. Rose loved the fact that she could buy a tiara and wear that to various functions, including these dinners with the king and queen and the princesses. So they're rubbing elbows with the royal family. They are meeting with all of the important dignitaries of the time. They're going to Wimbledon with the royal family. They're meeting with all of the other ambassadors from around the world, and they are also being at social occasions with all the upper class British, including, in Kick and Jack's case, that's Kathleen on the left in the middle picture, with Billie Hardington, a British nobleman who was in line to become the Duke of Devonshire. And she fell madly in love with him. This, we will point out a bit later, becomes quite a conflict, particularly for Rose. In later years, Patricia Kennedy would go out as a young woman, a young adult, would go out to Hollywood following in her father's footsteps to work with Kate Smith, the singer, who had a broadcast program. and she was helping to produce that. And she met the English actor, Peter Lawford, and they fell in love and married. And so she became Patricia Kennedy Lawford. And they had a home on the beach in California near Hollywood that Jack loved to come and visit and meet up with the Hollywood group, including some of the Rat Pack, which Peter Lawford was a part of, led by Frank Sinatra. So it actually became part of their futures that they married. In the case of Kik and Pat, married British men. All right, let's have the next, please. Unfortunately, this fairy tale begins to dim fairly quickly. The family arrives in 1938, and we see the clouds gathering, the dark war clouds gathering in certainly in the Far East, but obviously closer to them in Europe. We have Hitler taking over the Sudetenland, invading Czechoslovakia, the Anschluss against Austria, despite Neville Chamberlain's attempts at appeasement to try to sign some sort of agreement that would indicate that Hitler would stop after these incursions, somewhat similar to the kinds of things we see today with Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. Joe Kennedy was an isolationist, and so he was very supportive of Neville Chamberlain and the so-called appeasement agreement, or the Munich Pact. But as time went on and they came closer and closer to war, it was pretty clear. I just watched the movie Mrs. Miniver again, one of my all-time favorite movies. As the country gets closer and closer to war, and people start building bomb shelters in their backyards, and everyone is given a gas mask. This is a picture of young Bobby with his issued gas mask. And then, as Britain has to give up on appeasement, as in September of 1939, Hitler invades Poland, World War II is underway, and Britain has to, in turn, declare war on the Nazis, on Germany. Joe Jr., Kik, and Jack are all in London when they walk to Parliament to watch this historic event. And Doris Kearns Goodwin, the great Kennedy biographer, calls this the golden trio. So the two eldest boys, Rosemary obviously wasn't quite up to their level intellectually, but certainly Kathleen was. She was as charismatic as the two brothers. And I even like the fact that her pearls are sort of swinging as they walk along. This is just a very active, Jack looking right at the camera, the other two sort of looking to the side, but this golden trio that cannot realize what this oncoming war is going to mean for them. And it is such a tragedy to think that these three young, charismatic, brilliant individuals who could have offered so much to the world would all meet tragic ends. Next, please. Because of the oncoming war, the understanding that there would be an attack, maybe even an invasion of the Nazis on the UK and on the island, and certainly air attacks that we would come to know as the Battle of Britain, Joe realizes he has to send most of the family home. He decides that he will send them under different conveyances because he couldn't bear the thought if he sent Rose and all of the children on a plane or a ship, what if it were attacked? What if a ship sank and he lost his entire family? So he couldn't bear that. So he sent them in waves. The first group was Kik, Bobby, Rose, and Eunice, who went by ship. Another ship took off with young Teddy and Jean, the two youngest, with their governess. Joe and Jack went by airplane. So they all made it back safely. Joe was thrilled and felt very much alone, but was grateful that they'd all arrived safely. But Rosemary was doing so well in her convent. And you can see here with her dad, she looks just great. She looks like she is blossoming, which she was. And she was in a convent that was outside of London, so they thought she would be safe. I came across, in doing my work for my book on Rose Kennedy at the wonderful archive at the Kennedy Library in Boston, I came upon notes and letters that Rosemary wrote at this time. And you can tell that she has perhaps the intellectual capability of about a third grader. Her handwriting looks like it's from early grade school. She would write up and then she'd write down, there'd be big spaces, and her grammar and spelling weren't necessarily up to par. But she wrote to her father and said, I feel honor. Now, she may have meant honored, and she was using the British spelling for honor, but she says, I feel honor because you chose me to stay. She really felt special in this family of these 9 young people, all of whom had more intellectual capabilities than she had and were highly competitive and were encouraged by their families to family and their parents to be competitive in whether that was scholarship or school or athletics. She often felt left behind. And even though they tried to mainstream her, imagine how much joy she got from being able to stay on and see her father on weekends. And yet things became so bad that Joe had to send her back to the States as well. And he sent her with the, I will call them surrogate parents, Edward Moore Kennedy and his wife, Mary, who often, because they did not have children of their own, Edward Moore, the namesake for Edward Kennedy, was Joe's secretary. And so the Moores often would look after Rosemary and also watch out for the younger Kennedy children if their parents were away. So Rosemary did make it back safely, thank goodness, to the United States. Let's go to the next. And I hope you're thinking of your questions and submitting them, because we want to have a good conversation with you when we come to the end of our presentation today. We'll still have plenty of time to answer your questions. Joe, as you can imagine, was so upset that appeasement did not work. Here he is pictured on the left with Neville Chamberlain to Joe's right, as well as Sumner Wells and Lord Halifax. Sumner Wells from the State Department, Lord Halifax from the cabinet. Obviously, Chamberlain had to leave office. His government collapsed with the onset of the war, the collapse of the Munich Agreement. He would die of cancer not too long after that. Churchill takes over. You have a picture here of Ambassador Kennedy with him. But when Joe realized that this was the end of his hopes for appeasement and for neutrality for the United States, which many Americans hoped for. Listen, we had been through one world war already and lost many men and women, and we didn't want to go through this again. So there were many Americans, particularly led by Charles Lindbergh, who were isolationists at the time. And Joe Kennedy confided to his diary, I almost cried when he heard the declaration of war from the prime minister in 1939. He said, I saw my hopes crash too. Next, please. Now, Joe is called back to the United States to confer with FDR, his appointing president, because FDR knows that Joe has been an isolationist and is having grave doubts about whether he can stay on as ambassador of the US to the UK. Joe comes back to see his family, to meet with FDR, and he makes a very bad error of judgment in terms of speaking. He believes he's doing an off-the-record interview with a few journalists in Boston, but it turns out it's on the record. And he's jabbering away about what he thinks is going to happen in this oncoming war. And he says he thinks that democracy is finished in England. And then, in some ways even worse, says, and maybe the United States. Well, as I comment here on my slide, if you say democracy is finished in England and maybe in the United States, guess what, Joe? So is your political career. But not Rose's. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along. But Rose, as you will see here on the right in the 1950s, is one person of that pair, Joe and Rose, who has always known not to put a foot wrong in public or when she's meeting with the media. So she's able to come out in the 1950s, particularly in this picture when Jack is running in 52 for the Senate, and she leads the family. And you'll see Pat is here and Eunice is behind Rose, and Rose is speaking. And one of the things she would speak on is their time in England. And they would have these famous teas where the Kennedys would reach out to women in towns and cities around Massachusetts and invite all the women in a town to come and meet the famous Kennedy family. At this time, Jack in 52 is still not yet married to Jackie. He married the next year. And he was on crutches because of his bad back. So all the women would just pile around him when they'd have a receiving line. And one person suggested that all of the older women wanted to mother him and all of the younger women wanted to marry him. But my point is that Joe, while he remained very important in his sons' lives and in their political careers by offering money and strategy, pretty much had to stay behind the scenes because he was viewed as toxic in the political world by 1938-39. And indeed, he's recalled from his ambassadorship at that point. Next, please. I mentioned, though, the Anglophilia. It does not leave, nor does Kathleen or Kick's love for Billy. And so she joins up with the Red Cross. She goes back to London. Here she is in a Red Cross volunteer uniform, cycling through London. And she marries Billy Hartington, and she becomes the Marchioness. He's the Marquis of Hartington. She becomes the Marchioness of Hartington. And she someday would be, she hoped, when he was the Duke of Devonshire, she'd become the Duchess. Now, that was good for her. And you see young Joe, her brother, behind her at the civil ceremony. He's now in the Navy. He's a pilot. His brother Jack has signed on for the PT Corps. And Joe's the only person in the family who is there in this wartime marriage in May of 1944. Billy looks happy. Joe looks happy. Kick looks happy. Joe Sr. is not thrilled, but he writes to Kathleen, "You are tops with me and always will be." Not so Rose. Rose was a staunch Catholic, a staunch Roman Catholic, and she knew that Billy, a nobleman, a leader in the Church of England, was not going to give up his faith. He could not do what non-Catholics were asked to do in Catholic marriages, and that is raise children as Catholics. And so they could not be married in the Catholic Church. They had to be married in a civil ceremony. To Rose, the marriage was not valid. And so she almost worked herself into a nervous breakdown and a real split with Kathleen in the spring of 1944. Next, please. But what does this mean for the future political determinations for this family and their role? Well, Edward Kennedy, until the day he passed of cancer in 2008-9, I believe that was 2009, I believe August, at Hyannisport, he would say that his favorite picture of him with his father was the one you see on the top left when Teddy was about 6. And this was when his father was ambassador in London, and they're at his desk in the embassy. And Joseph wrote to young Teddy when Teddy went back when the war began, and he said, "I hope when you grow up, you will dedicate your life to making people happy." Well, certainly the Kennedy's politics, whatever you happen to think about it, you may be for or against it, but in their social policy, they really did try to help people. And Edward Kennedy was one of those leaders of social movements and social policy and public policy as 47 years in the United States Senate. Young Jean, his sister just ahead of him, was named by President Clinton to be the ambassador to Ireland, to the Republic of Ireland. And then at the height of Camelot, the height of the power of the Kennedy family is in 1962-63, before the president's assassination. The bottom photo, President Kennedy on the right, just outside the Oval Office. Young Teddy has just been elected to Jack's Senate seat from Massachusetts, and Bobby is his brother's attorney general in the cabinet. We all know, sadly, how all this would end, but they certainly did rise to the highest levels of power in the United States and in their ambassadorships. Next, please. The Kennedys, despite these tragedies, are still in England, still have a footprint in England. On the left is Kathleen's headstone at Chatsworth at the Hartington estate. in England. She sadly was killed in a plane crash in 1948 in the south of France, flying in a thunderstorm from Paris to the south of France with her soon-to-be new fiance. Her husband, Billy, was killed by a sniper in September of 1944, so they were barely married 3 months. This happened in Belgium. And she took up with yet another Protestant or Church of England. And worst of all for Rose and Joe, particularly Rose again, this man was divorced or about to be divorced. And so it sent Rose into another tizzy. But this beautiful headstone says at the bottom as an epitaph, joy she gave, joy she has found. And President Kennedy visited this gravesite several times, but particularly in the summer of 1963, when he was on his way to a summit with Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. He asked to stop by and place flowers at his sister's grave. They were very, very close, and he was devastated at her death. And the whole family was devastated when Joe Jr. died 1 month before Billy, when his plane exploded on a dangerous mission whereby it was packed with bombs and exploded before Joe could bail out. It was meant to be flown remotely from the coast of England over the English Channel to the French coast, where Hitler had placed the super cannons that were going to be raining down ammunitions on Britain. And so Joe is mentioned at the Cambridge American Cemetery and Memorial, and he also has a headstone at Arlington Cemetery next to his brothers, Bobby and Teddy, of course, where President Kennedy is buried with Mrs. Kennedy and 2 of their infant children. This picture below on the right is at Runnymede. This is President Kennedy's granddaughter, Tatiana Schlossberg. This is 10 years ago, the 50th anniversary of the assassination. She placed a wreath at her grandfather's memorial, which had been established by Queen Elizabeth shortly after the president's assassination. She thought Runnymede would be particularly appropriate for this John F. Kennedy Memorial. And she also created the Kennedy Foundation, which my good friend and colleague Emily Charnock now directs in England. And that is a scholarly exchange for British students to come and study in the United States. So as I say, the Kennedys continue to have a large presence there. Next, and almost finally, my London fairy tale happily continued this past summer. It had been quite some time, really, since I left Oxford 2 decades ago, but I was invited back by my friend Mark White, who is the director of the London POTUS Group, a group of presidency enthusiasts, US presidency enthusiasts who are either in government currently or former government officials, and particularly like Mark, professors. I was invited by them to come speak to the MPs. That's the top left photo here. I'm in the pink. And I am speaking on JFK and civil rights. That was their request for me. And then, of course, I made my pilgrimage and returned to Buckingham Palace to see the changing of the guard. And I just mentioned my friend Emily Charnock, Professor Emily Charnock here at the bottom left. She invited me to accompany her to the July 4th party at the new residence of our U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James. So that was quite a thrill, as you can imagine. And then for me, a tennis enthusiast, if not a particularly good player, I am genuflecting at center court at Wimbledon on the bottom right here, because one of my students from my days of teaching at Sweetbriar is married to the director of the All England Tennis Club. And I was there about 3 days before the championships began and was able, thanks to my friends, to see up close and personal and behind the scenes the All England Tennis Club, and had high tea on a balcony overlooking the grass courts. Well, with that, we'll come to our very last slide, which just asks you for your questions and thanks you for your attention, and also encourages you, if you're so inclined, to look at my biography of Rose Kennedy, The Life and Times of a Political Matriarch. which is all about her life, and particularly the role that she played as a political matriarch. And I love the cover of her speaking with Jack in 1962 at a dinner where they were giving out the very first awards for research in mental retardation. And it's a bit of a parlor game with me. What do you think she was saying? And so now I'm going to turn things over to my namesake, Barbara Hughes, and she will curate our questions.
I would like to thank you, dear Barbara, for an interesting look at the Kennedys while they were in England. And yes, I am enjoying the signed copy of Rose Kennedy. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to remind participants, you may submit questions using the dedicated Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we do have some questions. Our very first question is from Phil Williams, and he's asking, can you comment on Winston Churchill's opinion of Joe Kennedy and Joe's take on Winston? And Phil Williams is from the Charlottesville branch. He's the president of the Charlottesville branch.
Well, thank you, Phil. Another favorite ESU friend and friend of the Miller Center, where I am based here at UVA. And I want to thank Phil because I did my very first iteration of this talk at the Charlottesville branch some years ago. So thank you, Phil. And your question is about Joe Kennedy and Churchill. I don't think Churchill was very impressed with Joe Kennedy because Churchill knew that Britain could not be isolationist, and Joe was an isolationist. Going into what was going to become World War II, Winston Churchill, hoping to become the conservative prime minister and replace Neville Chamberlain, knew that he needed all the support he could get from the United States. I think he knew he would have that from FDR, but not to have that from the American ambassador was not very helpful. I suspect that because of that, Joe may not have felt the kind of close relationship that he did feel with Neville Chamberlain. So I would say that it was not a particularly advantageous relationship between the two men.
Okay, our next question is from Don Patillo, and he says, didn't Joseph Kennedy announce plans to run for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1940, presuming FDR would not run for a third term, and he had to withdraw when FDR made his announcement?
Thank you, Don, for that question. I think part of the issue for FDR in naming Joe to go to Europe, to go to England and be the ambassador, was to get him out of the United States, thinking that it was likely that Joe, if it wasn't officially announced, that was the word behind the scenes and maybe on the street in the Democratic Party. And let's remember that it wasn't clear until fairly close to the 1940 election that FDR would break with tradition set by George Washington to run for a third term. But he thought that he should, with war on its way. And thank goodness, in my view, FDR was our leader and did get along well with Churchill and created this amazing Anglo-American alliance that carries on to this day with NATO. And one of the reasons I think the ESU is so important. So I think that was part of the strategery, as they said in the Bush years and the George W. Bush years, part of the strategy on FDR's part. And yet, as soon as, if Joe had any thought at all in 1939 that he was going to be able to get the nomination, again, he ended his political career with his loose lips. They said during the war they sank ships. His loose lips sank his political career.
Okay, thank you for that question. We have another one from Elaine Middleman. What do you think is the lasting legacy of Rose Kennedy?
Oh, thank you so much, Elaine. I, in my book, make the argument that her legacy, I think, sometimes gets short shrift, in part because all of the women in the Kennedy family were given short shrift by the men, who tended to be chauvinistic. They weren't unusual for their time in the world and in American society and society around the world. And so she, despite the fact that she got to be the person on stage speaking for Jack and Bobby and Teddy until she was 90. She lived to be 104, by the way. And thank goodness she saved everything. So I got to look at all of the materials that she kept in the Kennedy Library, including the photographs. I went through probably 50 boxes of them. But I make the case that Rose should get so much credit for the legacy because, one, she literally produced the 9 children. 2, she was a perfectionist. She was both a Catholic perfectionist and a Victorian perfectionist. And the way the Kennedys presented themselves as these charming, charismatic, handsome, beautiful people with, by the way, their beautiful smiles, which one of the headmasters at, or at least schoolmasters at Choate, where Jack and Joe attended school, said Jack Kennedy's smile as a teenager could charm the birds out of the trees. They weren't born to have those beautiful smiles. Rose made sure that they took care of their teeth, that they had good health hygiene, and she sent them all to orthodontists in the 1920s and 30s when people hardly knew what orthodontia was. And so I think she gets credit for that. And then she gets credit for speaking so highly about the family to the media and to the newsreels and to the people who came to interview her on the old McNeil-Lehrer report in the 1970s. She wrote a memoir in the early to mid 1970s. And so she kept the family tradition and the family legacy alive even after the deaths of Jack and Bobby and her husband. And so I think she gets credit for whatever good you believe, if you do believe the Kennedys contributed to the world. I think she gets credit for that, and that should be her lasting legacy.
Okay, let's move on to the last question from Mary Burke. Did Rose Kennedy and the Queen Mother get along?
Well, thank you for that question. I just finished a brilliant biography of the Queen Mother, and it's by an author called William Shawcross. It is massive, so it's about 3 times the size of my Rose Kennedy biography, and so it's taken me a while to get through. But what I would say is this: the Queen Mother got along with everyone, so she and Rose were very similar in that way. They were both born to be in the public eye, and they were both born to be natural diplomats and to get along with people. And so I think they got along quite well because, if I may use the term, they were peas in a pod.
Okay, thank you for that. We do have another question, and we have time to do this, from James Broadhurst. Please comment on While England Slept, the original by Churchill and the rebuttal by JFK.
Well, thank you, James. Yes, as most of you know, John Kennedy wrote his honors thesis that became a book, in part because his dad knew how to get books published and have journalists like Arthur Kroc write the foreword and also punch up the prose. But it was generally well received. And it was to the credit, I think, of Jack Kennedy, showing, even as a college student, that he had an independence of thought that his brother Joe did not have. And if you are interested in this period of Jack Kennedy's life, I can highly recommend the new JFK biography by Harvard historian who has also won the Pulitzer Prize, Fred Logevall. And he also served on the panel with me at the House of Lords in June. And he writes brilliantly and has such insight into Jack's writing of that book. And what Jack was doing was stepping away from his father's isolationism and arguing that the British had fallen asleep at the switch. They weren't prepared to go to war. And what do we do in democracies when our democratic leaders, small d, aren't making the right decisions for us as they look to the future, whether that's on the domestic front or the foreign policy front or the domestic policy or the defense policy front? And I don't, even though I'm a political scientist, I don't have the definitive answer to that larger question, but I think it speaks really highly of a young Jack Kennedy that he went down that road as early as he did, and then became an independent thinker, very much separated from his dad. He admired his father. He liked his father. He appreciated his father's political strategies, but he departed from him as early as college years. And that's the importance of Kennedy's honors thesis turned published book.
Hey, well, I want to thank the participants for their very thoughtful questions. And again, thank you to you, Barbara Perry, for sharing your vast knowledge of the Kennedys and the Kennedys in England. Now, I would like to turn the program over for final remarks by Jeff Schnabel. Jeff is past president of the Kansas City branch, a member of the Happy Hour Committee, and chair of the 2021 AGM. So Jeff, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Barbara. Since our executive director, Karen Kropowicz, couldn't be with us today, on behalf of the Happy Hour Committee, I would like to thank Dr. Perry and the ESU Central Florida branch for sponsoring today's program, the Kennedys in England. Topics for these happy hour programs come from our ESU members, friends, and guests, and we truly appreciate your ideas for future programs. The ESU is a member-based organization, and if you are not already a member, please consider joining the ESU. Also, we really appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey at the end of today's program. Our next happy hour program will be Wednesday, September the 13th, co-hosted by our ESU chairman, Dr. Quinn Pieper and Michael Harold. They will tell us about their newly published book, Classical Shindig, Amateur Artistry from the Simple to the Sublime. It is quite literally an entertaining book that celebrates their love of food, music, and people. Don't miss this special happy hour. And one additional reminder, the early bird registration for ESU's annual conference ends this Sunday, August the 20th. So as a reminder, please register as soon as you can. It's going to be a great conference in Kansas City, and we hope that you all can attend. Again, we appreciate your feedback about today's program, and thank you for joining us.
And I'd like to again thank Barbara Perry for being our guest speaker. We so thoroughly enjoyed everything that you shared today, Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. My pleasure. And anytime I can be a part of the English Speaking Union, I'm there.
Great. We'd love it. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for joining us.